Okay, so I guess we are on time. Okay, so let me kick this off. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the new session of Sitecore User Group Jaipur. This time, we are delighted to have Alex Washtell with us to present on his topic. Allow me to provide a brief introduction to Alex. Alex is a 8-time Sitecore MVP and Sitecore plus Headless CMS consultant as well. He's also an active Sitecore committee member. So I would like to hand over this session to Alex. And Alex, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be able to present like this. So yeah, I'm very pleased to be able to join. You've actually taken the wind out of my first slide because that's all going to talk about me, but that's okay because I can skip over that one now. I'd say if anyone has any questions or anything, what will probably be the best thing is as you go through, just I've got the chat open on another screen here. So please feel free to put anything into the chat or we can pick it up at the end. That'll be a great way to pick up on any questions. So the idea of this talk that I've written is to serve as an introduction to SXA for those who haven't used it and how it fits in with the JSS headless architecture within Sitecore. So that's how we'll go. This is basically just to say exactly what you've just said about me. So thank you very much. The only extra thing I'd say is I'm on Sitecore Slack as @Kasaku. So if you have any questions or want to reach out to me afterwards, please, you can always feel free to contact me on there. You're more than welcome. So we're going to start off with a little bit of a history lesson. So a bit of a quick history on JSS and SXA. So JSS, if you're not too aware of it, this enables Sitecore to be used as a headless CMS. It was introduced in Sitecore 9. The server component was originally known as Sitecore JavaScript Services. It's now known as Sitecore Headless Services, and this is because we also have the ASP Net Core rendering host. So it's not just about JavaScript these days. Effectively, any client can communicate with it. So it's been renamed. So usually refer to it as Sitecore Headless Services. That said, the term JSS still gets used all the time. It's always versions of it have been tightly coupled to Sitecore versions historically. So usually, if you wanted to update to a later version of JSS, you would be doing that, coupling that with a version, an upgrade of Sitecore, which has been a bit tricky in the past. So if you wanted to get particularly new versions or in particular like bug fixes, you always have to sort of move your Sitecore version up as well. You can move JSS alongside it. It's extremely well supported by Sitecore. I'd say it's not going away. It's like a core tenet. I know like over the past few years, people have wondered with MVC and JSS and Headless, like what's the core direction? But Headless is only getting bigger and bigger. So it really is a core tenet of Sitecore, and they provide first-class support for the headless services, as well as specifically for Next.js, which is one of the most popular JavaScript headless front-end platforms for running these sites. So yeah, it's effectively it's here to stay. So that's JSS, and then there's SXA. So SXA, which is the Sitecore Experience Accelerator. The idea of this was to accelerate website development. So the idea with this originally was it was to provide common features and components to save reinventing the wheel every time. So there'd be a lot of features that agencies, developers of websites were often building, having to put onto sites each time. And the idea was, well, if we could provide all of that as a standard sort of suite of functionality, that could really speed up the idea of development. So these were things like grid components, search, Google Maps, I think common features such as like redirects. Some of those we're going to be looking at later. And sort of the idea with this, you could effectively reach like a no-code rapid development approach to building websites. So though it was built on ASP.NET MVC, the idea was you wouldn't need to build any code to build a simple website, but you could still add in extra code with your own components as part of the site. So really it was typically aimed at smaller websites that could be with quite smaller sort of sites with simple design that could be turned around very quickly, sort of in a matter of days to a few weeks, not months, to get a new site out. That was the idea of it. So it was originally a third-party library built by an agency, but it was brought into Sitecore in 8.3. Likewise with JSS, versions of it were tightly coupled to Sitecore versions. Not always as tightly. Now they are quite tightly. So effectively, if you're on Sitecore 10.1, you'll be using SXA 10.1. If you're on 10.2, you'll be using SXA 10.2, etc. So it's the same story. If you want to upgrade one, you'd be upgrading the other. As I mentioned, it began with support for MVC. It has previously had some support for headless. It features something called JSON rendering, so you could output your data from your content from Sitecore components as JSON. So you could then have a front end pick that up. So it did have some support, but it was quite basic, and that's what they've looked to change. So Headless SXA, which is what we're looking at today. So Sitecore 10.3 and XM Cloud now have an improved support for headless, known as Headless SXA. And what do we mean by Headless SXA? Well, so it's not a new product, really. It's just adding better support for existing SXA features in JSS and headless services. So it's not really a new, like a brand new product. It's just improvements in SXA, so that, and additional things so we can make use of it within JSS. In XM Cloud, Headless SXA is considered essentially the default approach from Sitecore. So if you're building a headless site on XM Cloud, you're expected to use Headless SXA. That's what they will sort of demo to clients. It's what they're stating is like, you should be using this. And there's sort of like not many reasons to not use it, really. So as you'll show, that said, you can use as much or as little of it as you like, as I'll demonstrate. So, but it's really the base scaffolding, the main part of it, the server-side part you're expected to use. So, however, this new additional support is only for JavaScript Next.js implementations only currently. So if you're using ASP.NET Core rendering, and I'd love to hear if you are, because I don't meet many people that are. So if anyone's building sites with ASP.NET Core rendering, I'd be very interested to speak to you. So currently, this additional support is really just targeting Next.js. Now, it doesn't mean you can't use it in ASP.NET Core. So any headless client can make use of Headless SXA, because a lot of SXA features are on the server side, the Sitecore side. So things like site management and partial layouts and redirects, those things that I will mention later for those who don't know them. But what you don't get, and what is provided for Next.js, is a large front end starter application which provides a whole suite of renderings ready to go, like those grid components out of the box. You wouldn't get those with ASP.NET Core. And there's middleware and things to support those redirects works all out of the box with Next.js, whereas if you're using ASP.NET Core, you'd have to do that yourself. But anyone could make that, so you can make a name for yourself today by releasing the ASP.NET Core rendering host SXA starter, and provide all those same things for ASP.NET Core. They haven't said they won't do it. Sitecore have actually said it's really based on need. So if there was requests to add those as implementations, along with other platforms, so they support Next.js. But if people were clamoring for, they wanted a Nuxt.js or other or an Angular version, they would look at they may look at adding it. So it's really based on demand, and at the moment there's just huge demand for the Next.js side, because it's by far the most popular implementation that people want to use. So what do you get when you use when you're looking at this Next.js SXA starter? So what you're getting is a starter front-end solution, which is bundled with SXA components and middleware. I've included sort of a screenshot on the right of it here. So you can think of this as something that will kickstart your build with a whole bunch of things out of the box. it's literally like a starter application. So I know previous times we used to have issues where Sitecore would release something. Sitecore released like Habitat, for example, as a demo implementation of this is how you could build. It's a reference implementation how to build a Sitecore site, but it was never intended to be a starter kit for you to then build your sites on top. And that's what a lot of developers did, and then that caused problems because it was seen there's a bit of mixed messaging, and though it was intended to be a demo, you weren't meant to actually use it. This is different, and this is Sitecore providing a out of the box base implementation. Say you can take this and start building on top. In fact, we recommend that you start building on top of this. A whole lot of things are set up for you, so it's kind of doing work for you. If you weren't to do this, you'd have to be building quite a few things yourself. So the messaging is from them is like really like this is intended for you to use, and you'll get things out of it. So there's good reason to use it. Like I said, so it's the recommended approach by Sitecore. That said, I will say it is opinionated. So by that I mean decisions have been made. So if you get this, it's already set up to use Bootstrap, for example, as the gridding, the CSS framework underneath it. It uses an approach to CSS of bundling assets. Now, if you yourselves or your front end development team, if you have separate teams for that, if they have their own grid system, or if they don't use Bootstrap and they really want to use Tailwind, or they don't use like just regular bundling of CSS and they use CSS modules or things like that, any of those things, you would have to rework how this application works. And you're free to do that, but it does mean there is some work there to do it. If you are on board with Bootstrap and how they approach that's there, then you won't have to redo any of that work. But that is one thing to bear in mind with it. And I should say yes. So you don't need any of this. You can make use of a lot of SXA features whilst completely rolling your own front end from scratch. So you don't need to use this application at all. You can still target SXA on the server side and make use of a lot of SXA features if you completely build this yourself. That said, you have to expect to be doing more work because you're throwing out stuff that's already been built for you. But even if you're not using any of the components in this application, like so, if you don't like the Bootstrap and you don't like how they've done the grid components, or a few things like the navigation, that's absolutely fine. And though Headless SXA is pushed as the default approach by Sitecore, it's not expected that you have to use their grid layout and you have to use their components. They really want you to use Headless SXA, and from this point of view, my understanding is they're recommending that you use this, but it's not a default, as in saying you're not breaking away from Sitecore if you don't use these. So you could drop the layouts and you could drop the components and say, I don't want to use those. I just want to target Headless SXA and I'm going to roll my own. That's fine. I would say if you're building an XJS site, I would absolutely use this. Even if I was working with a team who really wanted to change all of the CSS and say this is unacceptable. So we need to use these other platforms because that's how we're used to building it. I would still use this application because it's a very up-to-date Next.js application. It's got middleware and scripting and boilerplate stuff that's in there that doesn't really change how you build your site, but it does a lot for you in terms of ensuring it does all the communication with the Sitecore layout service is already built into this Next.js application. So out of the box, it's ready to start requesting pages from Sitecore and building up the content of pages by interpreting what's coming out of layout service. So that is all really, really useful, and I absolutely wouldn't throw that away. I'd look to take this and then edit it if I had to go down that road. Just to say how up to date it is. So one of the good things is like current version as of today uses Next.js 14.1. Now Next.js 14.1 was released in January the 18th. So this is actually quite up to date. So we're a couple of months away since then. So this application does get updated fairly regularly, I'd say. And you don't have to, it's not necessarily tied to Sitecore's Headless SXA. So you can still be getting updates. You can pull down the latest version of this code and merge it into your repository to ensure that you're kind of getting the latest versions as they change them. And it's all open source. So you can go see, I'll be showing you where the repositories are, so you can see how like the updates, and you can file issues on GitHub as things, if things come up. And so you'll see how these get addressed and picked up. It currently uses the pages folder approach in Next.js. So this is the older stuff. So Next.js has two routing approaches, what's known as like the page router and the app router. These days, Next.js has moved on to the app router, and that is what they push as the default approach. Currently, the Next.js SXA application does still use the pages approach, which is still supported by Next.js. It's just that saying app router is the way forward, but pages router is still supported. This uses the pages approach. I will say though, I do know like Sitecore have stated that they are looking to move to the app router approach, so it will get moved in that direction eventually. There's no telling of when, but it will move that way. So they are well aware. And I will say, as someone who's worked with Next.js applications inside of Sitecore and outside of Sitecore, they're very respectful, I think, of how the Next.js approach. Like they haven't really tried to break or warp how Next.js works. They are building this application in a way that makes sense with how Next.js works. So for people who might join your site or join your team who don't necessarily have Sitecore experience, but they have Next.js experience and they're used to building front-end applications with that, should be used to kind of what they're seeing, how the components are built out, how the middleware all works, all ties like correctly into Next.js, which I think is good. Like I said before, it includes a bunch of useful scripts and scaffolding code. So there's things in there that are really useful. Things such as when you add new components into your, so you can see there's a components folder over here, and then if I add in a new component, there are scripts in there so that I can run a script and it will generate the mappings between that component and the layout service. So it does certain things by convention. So if in my Sitecore side, if I've created a rendering called content block, and I come over to here in this, and I create a rendering in here called content block, it all just starts working for you. So it sort of does, there's scripts in there that do quite a bit of the work for you, which is quite nice. So it just helps for aid the speed of development. And another additional feature that they've added in is server-side data retrieval at a component level. So just to explain this, so I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Next.js, but Next.js typically takes a page, so outside of Sitecore, Next.js typically takes a page approach to how it retrieves data and builds pages on the server side. So if I was building a front-end application, I might go to a URL, and Next.js knows, well, that URL is a product page, and I know for a product page, I need to go call off to my PIM or my database to go get my product information, and then add that into the context of my page, so that when I render some components out on the page, they know, oh, this is the current product. So like this is its ID, this is its title. With Sitecore, we take a more modular approach to pages, like rather than add things at the top level of a page, because we allow pages to effectively contain any renderings we want them to. So from a Sitecore's perspective, you might you have a page and you add some renderings to it. We don't necessarily know straight away, well, this page will have a product rendering on it. Therefore, at the very top of the rendering of the page, I need to go get some product information, because our pages are much more dynamic. We don't know what's going to be on them at all. So what Sitecore have added is they've added this server-side data retrieval at a component level, which is pretty clever. And they've so effectively I could create my product display component, And when I build that component, I can put in a function in there to say this is when this is being run server side, this is the code that you need to run. So before rendering this product on the server, you need to go off to the database and get the product information so that I've got access to it to render this component, which you can't do in Next.js. Well, without like writing a similar system to what Sitecore done. And the way they've done it is they've also they've tied it in. They've effectively, there's the get server side props function within Next.js, and Sitecore basically reused that. They basically the way you write that function is very similar to how you'd write it in the page level. So that's pretty clever. I do know, I haven't actually checked as of today, but there was an outstanding issue that has been raised with it from a security perspective in terms of how that code, because really, if you're writing server-side code when you build your front-end bundles, none of your server-side code should be getting bundled into your front-end build. So if you've got code calling off to databases and is using like environment variables and to go off to call a database, you don't want that in your front-end code because there's no need for it to be there, and you might leak some information. There was an outstanding issue with that. I haven't checked it actually recently in the past few weeks to see if that's been addressed. It's been acknowledged by Sitecore, and there are ways around it. It was Corey Smith that's raised that on their GitHub and posted a workaround for it as well. But I imagine that'll get fixed. I mean, like I said, it was over a month ago that I last checked to see if there was any updates on that. So yeah, that was a little bit of a detour on the component level, but I think that's really worth mentioning because it's very useful. Lastly, there's middleware in here. So there's middleware for redirects, but there's also includes redirects for Sitecore personalize in there as well. So that's just sort of out of the box. It's got support for personalizing your components using personalize, and that's built into it. You may not use it because you may not be using personalize, but I think it's very neat. So within this sort of middleware folder, there's a collection of middlewares, and that's one of them that's in there by default. So if you are then looking to use that, it integrates very well in with this application because they've already considered that. I'd summarize all those previous 3 slides. I'm just going to take a sip. It's saying this is effectively an open source repo where all this code is that you can pull down from GitHub. So you can clone this repository and you can change whatever you like in it. It's up to you. You can change and fiddle with it as much as you want, but you will deal with the upgrade consequences. So by that I mean, if you pull down this repository and you go changing components in it because you don't quite like how they work, next time you pull down that repository because they've made updates, then you'll have to deal with, they've made changes to the components that you've made changes to. You can then have issues such as merging problems, because you've got to make sure that you can merge your changes into each other. Now there are ways around that. For example, I would say straight out the bat, I would avoid changing any of their components. Doesn't mean you have to use them, but for instance, as I'll touch on in a bit, SXA has a feature for being able to clone renderings. So if you don't like the out-of-the-box renderings and you want to work them completely differently, like the navigation, so I don't want to use this navigation, I would look at cloning it and then you building your own navigation there. So we'll look at cloning, but effectively we'll copy everything about it and then let you have a new rendering that you can edit and change, and then you can leave the old code and you don't have to worry about that anymore. And you will avoid merging issues that way. I'd say like this sort of, I've put a big but on this, but this is probably something that we're all quite used to, because ever since, if you've been working with Sitecore a long time, you've almost certainly made changes to pipelines and like done server-side extensions. And every time we update Sitecore, there are potentially breaking changes because things on the server side have changed, and we've had to work through and look to see if we need to change any of our code to operate it. So I think we're already used to knowing that, if we upgrade, there may be issues. But I effectively think I'd highlight it for this. This one's a little bit more volatile, but I think there are ways around it. So I don't think it's too much of a source of a worry. It's just something to bear in mind. So how would you get started with this? So as I mentioned, this is for 10.3 and for XM Cloud. So if we're looking from Sitecore 10.3 perspective, you can start off by running xpx create Sitecore JSS. This is effectively a application generator. So you run this and it will bootstrap and build you an application. It'll prompt you to ask what kind of templates you want. So create Sitecore JSS will just create you a starter application, and it actually has a few different ones in there, such as React, Angular, but there's also one called Next.js. And what I'm showing you here today is specifically the Next.js one. If you choose the React one, you'll get a much simpler and different application that doesn't have all the things that I'm showing you in here today. So specifically, you'd want to select the Next.js one. And then you're also prompted to see if you want to add on any templates. And one of those is JS SXA, which is the one that you'd want to add on, because that's what adds in all these SXA components and additional middleware. This little tool is interactive, so you can run it on the command line and just step through these, or it can be parameterized for scripted setup. So if you want it as a one-liner, someone can just run and have it just pick out the Next.js and Next.js SXA parts, then you can do that. If you want more information on this tool, you can just either Google Sitecore JSS App Initializer, or put a bit.ly link, or even a QR code. And any of these will basically take you to the JSS App Initializer documentation on it. And then we also have the XM Cloud side of things, which works a little bit differently with XM Cloud. So there's this GitHub repository here. This repository is not just the Next.js side. This is a full XM Cloud repository, which also then has the Next.js SXA starter within it it's effectively like a mono repo, and then it has one of these, the Next.js application in it, called SXA starter. That already has in it the Headless SXA add-on, so the Next.js SXA that I mentioned before, and another one called Next.js multi-site. And also, it doesn't mention here, but there's a Next.js XM C for XM Cloud specific additions as well. This repository is Sitecore's recommended approach. It's maintained by the development team, and it gets all the new features as they are released. So any additions they make to SXA, such as what I've just mentioned there, as in I mentioned previously that Next.js updated to 14.1, that goes into this repository. The previous the JSS SDK that I just mentioned previously for 10.3, they are in separate repositories, but they sort of do mirror each other. There's a relationship between the two. Typically, the JSS app initialize one that gets updated first. That's where all the the latest version of Next.js is, and then after a while, those get merged into this one, or they're not quite merged, but the same changes are made into the XM Cloud Foundation head repository. I will say for XM Cloud, so previously, getting up and running with this, the documentation's not been brilliant, but it's really come along. Sitecore have been working on something called Sitecore Accelerate, which is a new level of documentation to really help developers and all parts of the team get up to speed with how they should be working with Sitecore and recommendations. If you're looking at using XM Cloud, I'd strongly suggest you use Sitecore Accelerate. It's just Google Sitecore Accelerate, and that's got getting started guides with XM Cloud. But I mean, the very short version of it is if you're just running it locally, if you're not connecting up to the remote XM Cloud instance, really, as long as you can clone this repository, if you've got your license, then it's just 2 lines. You can basically initialize the repository and then run up, and that'll use Docker to get XM Cloud running locally on your machine. So it's pretty quick and easy to get running. One of the useful things about the XM Cloud Docker is that it updates every time. So every time you run it, it will always pull down the latest XM Cloud image via Docker, which is really useful. So you're always running sort of on the latest and greatest version of XM Cloud, just as you would be if you were running on a deployed site on the SaaS XM Cloud that Sitecore provide. So both of these are good ways to, like, if you want to get started looking at Next.js, you can use either of these methods, either with Sitecore 10.3 or XM Cloud. For the information, so that I did provide that repository, but there's also this, you can GitHub XM Cloud Foundation, and that's how that'll get you to that GitHub. But there's a link and a QR code that just takes you straight to that repository. So let's look at what do we. I've talked a lot about kind of the Next.js side, but this is just to look at on the server side what sort of things that you get with SXA. So a typically SXA site looks like this on the left. You can sort of get a lot of things like out of the box with it. So I've just taken a snapshot of what it looks like in the content editor. So you're going to get a basic sort of page template. So you've got the home template here. You're going to get a media folder. You're going to get data source folders. You're going to get a site dictionary. You're going to get a whole thing, a bunch of presentation settings. Now, just to kind of talk through these. One of the main things that with SXA is that it's multi-tenant at its core. So effectively, it's built to support running more than one site in your Sitecore instance. So everything within it is built with that in mind. This is why you can see things like such as there's a localized media folder, so you can open it rather than using the main media library folder as sort of the root of Sitecore content folder. A site would use this media folder, which really is just sort of tunneling down into a particular folder within the regular media library. But it allows you to just have okay, I'm looking at media just for this site, rather than all 2, 3, 4, 5, however many sites I'm running in Sitecore. Same thing with dictionary. So typically we've always had the Sitecore dictionary, but it's not been localized to particular sites. So if you use the regular Sitecore dictionary, then any site would have access to that dictionary. But they've just sort of built a very similar system, so you can have a dictionary for one site that doesn't affect a dictionary for another site. So if you have the same keys but with different terms, they won't interact with each other. Another thing I just mentioned on the site dictionary is one of the things that they add on the Next.js site is it grabs that dictionary at the very start. There's some middleware to make sure that it's grabbed. So, and it ties into Next.js's translation library that they've got in there. So straight out of the box, you get a function in your SXA starter that will allow you to just, similar to what we used to be able to do in Sitecore MVC, just be able to say like translate and give it the key. And it just all works out of the box. So that's an example of the sort of thing with the SXA starter that they've thought about and that you're getting. You get a whole bunch of included components out of the box. So effectively renderings or components that you can add. So some of these ones on the left are to do with layout. So working with a grid system, we have a container for making sure that content doesn't run the full width of the page. We have the ability to be able to create splits of columns and rows on the page. And then we get a bunch of content components. I'm going to go through these on a future slide. So I'm just illustrating sort of these are the ones that you're going to get, but we'll step through them. So what we mean by that is, so you can see here, I've got, like, let's say I've highlighted, like I've got my container, which is my blue box here, to make sure my contents are not going full width. I've got my row splitter to split my content across 2 rows, and then I've got my column splitter so I can add things into each of these 4 things, and I can decide how I want this to look on mobile. Like, do I want it to be like just 2 images across on mobile, but 4 images across? All of that is out of the box. And if you didn't want to build any grid components, if you're like just happy with how it works, if you use that Next.js starter, you don't have to touch the grid at all. You've already got a system that allows you to just drop things onto the page and say how many you want to appear across a page, how it's going to look on mobile, tablet, all of these things. And you don't have to do any code for that out of the box at all. And then we get these content components. So, and some of these are all quite fairly straightforward, and some of them they just do exactly what they say. So there's a content component called title. So that will display the current page title, like reading it out of a title field on the page. You have an image, so for rendering an image with an optional link and caption on the image. Rich text, so point it at you can put it at a data source, and then that will render a rich text field from the data source. You have page content, which is much like rich text, but reads it from the current context item. So the current page. So out of the box, the default template in SXA, every page has got a title field, and it's also got a page content field. So you have the page context for that, the page content rather. There's a component in there called content block, which is actually just a simple React component for demo purposes. So it effectively shows you when you get this, if you were to add your own new component, you can have a look at how content block works. To look at it, it's just a very, very simple, like the most basic component that you could create. So it's a good one to sort of copy and look at. This is the bare minimum you need to be able to do to build your own component with its own data source. Typically how we've always like built components is a really good like just sample component. You have a promo, which is for combining image, text, and links for visual site navigation. So when you're wanting to have images with some brief bit of text and a link underneath it that takes the user off to another bit of the site, that's a promo. And then there's navigation. So this renders navigation links based on the current page in various forms. So out of the box, this does come with design and styling for various different ways of doing navigation, such as if you want a top level navigation that's running like a bar that runs across your site, top of your page rather, or you want mobile navigation. So when you shrink it down, you've got like the hamburger thing to click on and get a mobile drop down. They've got a design for that out of the box that you can use. And lastly here, there's a link list. So effectively you point it at a data source and it will render a list of links. So if you're wanting to feature like links off to other pages or on a content page, have links to like PDFs and media files, then you could do that using a link list. So this just shows an example. So using that previous picture, but rather than looking at the layout components, these are like the content components that I'd have. So I have navigation at the top here where it's rendering the home page, but also sort of the top level pages in the content tree. I've got my title coming out. And then each of these is a separate promo. So I've linked to a particular page and I'm providing an image and some text. So it's very easy to like out of the box build like sort of this, like, kind of a basic content site that you can then obviously style further. This is just using this. What you're seeing here are the styles that you get out of the box with Next.js. And what if the bundle components aren't enough? So there's a handful of components I've made there, but almost certainly you're going to be needing to build additional components on top. Sitecore provide a component extension flowchart for this. So effectively, this is a flowchart. Don't worry about screenshotting this or anything, but I'll link you to it. It's effectively, it helps you decide. It asks by asking you a bunch of questions. What's the sort of extension that you need to be doing? So, and because there's multiple different ways that you could add an extension. So, for example, sometimes if you've got an existing component, but you just want to change the style of it, maybe that's just a custom style. So you don't need a new component. For example, if I just drop back, if we said, actually, we want this, we've got this text, we want this here, but we want a version where this is centered, like the text and image is centered rather than on the left-hand side. So where we would have used like rendering parameters inside MVC, that's known as like a custom style. So that's the first port. Then maybe you need to do a little bit more than that. So you may want to add a new variant. So a variant is where you may want to adjust the output of the HTML. So a variant will be, rather than using styling, you might say, well, actually, there's a case here where we don't want the link to show. And I guess you could use CSS to hide the link, but maybe better than that is if you want a version of this promo that doesn't have that link, maybe it puts the link on the image instead, you can create a variant. So it's the same component, but then you'll get a drop down. The editors would get a drop down to select a variant. So you might have one that just says text link for this default one, but then they could change their drop down, say, actually, I want the one that's an image link. They change that, and then it's changing the HTML underneath it so that it outputs a slightly different version, but all of the data underneath is the same. It's the same data source. That's something that's built into SXA, and those are called rendering variants. After that, you have cloning a component, which I mentioned at the very start. So if you wanted to take one of the existing components and clone it. The useful thing about cloning is you run a script to do it, and it clones everything. So it's like all the rendering template and the data source template, all those things that rendering uses, that component. It creates new versions of those and makes sure they're all pointing at the right place. So you've now got a completely separate component that you could start editing, which is quite useful if you're starting from a similar base, but you then want to change what's there. And so that's why I was suggesting that earlier. If you were looking at like wanting to change how the navigation works, you could start off with their existing navigation as a base. And after that, at the very end, you've got a new component. So this is like brand new component. If you just don't want to use anything at all, and what you're building isn't really similar to any other component, then you could just create a brand new component. So yeah, this flow chart is what they provide to be able to go through that. Again, so here's a QR code for that, or you can just Google Sitecore Headless SXA flowchart, and you'll get there. And then, yeah, so I've shown some components, but SXA is actually it's a lot more than just components. It's valid. It's got value even if you dismiss all of those components. If you look at those and go, I don't want to use any of those, it's still valuable because it's got lots of things on top of that. So just highlight, there's a whole bunch of things here, and I'm going to just step through a whole of them. And these are actually, I'm not sure if I would say they're more useful than components, but there's a lot of use in here, and these are typically a lot of things that people would often be building, like devs would be building into their sites anyway. And so this is like really, I say, where actually some of the gold is, because it's all stuff that comes out of the box and just works. So for example, redirects. I'm pretty sure that everyone here, having worked on a Sitecore site at some point, has had to implement a redirect system into their site, if maybe on every site. So previously we would have used modules, or we might have written one ourselves, because you're going to have content, especially if you're migrating from an old site. Content editors are always going to want the ability to say, actually, we've got a new temporary marketing URL, or we've moved this page, we need to be able to redirect users. It's such a common requirement. So that comes out of the box. There's a redirects item inside content editor, or like a redirects folder. So it's already built, so content editors can manage this using Sitecore items. They can add redirects, they can support regex, and then Next.js already has middleware. So with that SXA starter, out of the box on a brand new site, you have something that if you add in redirects and you're using that Next.js site, it'll just get followed. It uses GraphQL and it grabs all the redirects. So it's then got them in memory and can redirect users every time someone comes to the page. So it's not having to call Sitecore off to look at redirects every time. So that comes out of the box. Has built-in sitemap. So in Next.js, it provides an API endpoint under the sitemap XML URL. So when you hit that URL, it's actually calling an API endpoint that will query Sitecore to build up a sitemap of pages. Again, very common requirement. Pages and partials, which I'm not really showing today, but are an incredibly useful part of SXA. So these are a means of providing reusable layouts for design consistency. So again, it's a very common requirement on sites to say, have things such as, we want a header, and that header has to appear the same on every page, but that header is actually made up of multiple components. For example, we've got our top level header navigation component, but under that we might then have a breadcrumb component. And they're two separate components, but we want those components to appear on every page. And we've been able to do things like that in Sitecore before by making use of like the shared layout. So we could go to a standard layout of an item and put those in there. So when you create new pages, they will already be there. But page and partial layouts, they make that more robust, really. So you can now create a partial layout, call it, say, header. You can put the components you want in there. You then create what's called a page design. So you might call it just, my default page design always includes a header layout. And then your pages, as long as they use that page design, which you can then match up by template. So you can use my typical page content, like let's just call it page. That uses my default page design. That will always then have that layout at the top. And then each page can just focus on the layout for it. Only needs to contain the layout, the other components for that page. And the handy thing is, if you go at some point, someone goes, we need to put a banner across every page to make sure, like a new component, and we've got a banner that says, a sale is happening this weekend. We want to drive everyone to it. You don't then have to figure out, okay, we need a system of making sure we get that into every page or have planned for that already. You go, well, I'll just go to our partial layout for header, add in that new component, publish that, and then it's suddenly appearing across all of those pages. And then it also does useful things such as if you're on that page, you can prevent editors from taking things out of that header because it's in the partial. You can stop them from saying, actually, I want to take out the header. And breaking pages in the ways they shouldn't be able to. So it's a really, really useful part of SXA. And I've seen people do this as a custom implementation in sites before, build out their own system for doing this. But this is just woven into Sitecore and the rendering and the layout service and how these layouts get built. So very, very useful. Cross-site sharing. So there's if you do have multiple sites, that you're running, there's also, they have their siloed content, but SXA has means for being able to share content across multiple sites as well, which can be useful. There's content tagging, so you can tag, if you're building a system like a blog and you're wanting to be able to tag various different pages to say like what kind of page it is, that's already built into there. You could then use something. So one thing I would say is like the MVC version of SXA does have more components, and that already had content tagging components inside there. So if you're making use of all this content tagging, you are able to drop on renderings that would say render a tag cloud or render me a link of like a list of links that are like pages that are tagged with this particular tag. Whilst the SXA starter doesn't currently have those components in, you can absolutely use the GraphQL to query and say, call into Sitecore to say, get me all pages or get me all items with this tag. So you can, the server side, you've got this in Sitecore, so you can make use of tagging it. Just at the moment, there isn't any out of the box support in the Next.js site for renderings to get those. I wouldn't be surprised if that's something they add in the future. So because they've already got the tagging side, I wouldn't be surprised if the Next.js site gets updated to say, there's a function there for easily getting that tagged content. It's the sort of thing that one of these days I'll do this talk and someone say that's already there. It got added last week or something. So I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up. A few more things. There's advanced caching. So you can set caches at the site level. So we've got that. This is something I didn't touch on earlier with that multi-site approach. I mentioned how you wouldn't necessarily want the dictionary being shared across sites. But at the same time now, you might have, I'm building a component like a rendering, and I'm going to use that rendering on more than one site. You can say, well, in this, like rather than set the caching level at on the rendering level to say this is always cached, you could say, well, on this site, I will always want it to be cached, but on this site, don't always want it to be cached for reasons you might have. So you can set the caching level there. You can set it on placeholders, and it also supports what's called donut caching, which is where if you'd say, I want to, let's say you have a header, but then there's something within that header, such as whether a user is logged in or maybe not. Maybe you change what's shown at the top, like a little, if the user's logged in or logged out, there's a bit of the header that changes. You can say, well, I want to cache the header rendering, but then that other component that sits in there shouldn't get cached, which is called donut caching, because you're sort of like punching a hole in your caching level, and that there's support for that in there as well, to make sure you're not over caching things. You can make sure that inner bits can still have their own caching levels. There's navigation filters. So this allows you to editors can mark pages that won't appear in certain navigation. So for instance, let's say you've got that breadcrumb navigation that I mentioned before. Sometimes editors will want to be, well, we don't want this particular folder or page to appear in the breadcrumb because we want to split up the content. We want that to appear in the URL, such as like we've got articles / something. But if you go to articles, it's not a page. So you could go to that item and you can use a navigation filter. So you can just tick it and say, don't appear in breadcrumb, or don't appear in sitemap, or don't appear in thing. And it's already built in to there. So that's quite useful. And it saves us. I've seen, again, I've seen in many sites before people having to build custom, like a separate field that says "don't appear in breadcrumb," and it just means you don't have to build those separate fields. They're already there. There's error support, so there's support for 404 and 500 pages out of the box. Those will just work. There's advanced data sources, so the sources for fields, you've got sort of there's a set of advanced tokens that you can use, which are really handy. So we won't buy that for a token. I mean, when you're writing your Sitecore query for where content should be pulled from, like either in a Sitecore field or like the data source, you can effectively say, well, I want you to look at this, pages of this template, but only under my site. And you do that by doing like $site :// and then it will look in localized areas, or you can say within your own page. So these are really useful, and these are all the sort of things they had to build into it to support this sort of multi-site setup. So yeah, those are useful. And then finally, it's got custom styles, which is a bit like it's like kind of like rendering parameters and aids in adding additional styles to components that editors can easily toggle on and off. So this is if I add, I can add renderings to the page, and I don't need to create rendering parameters if I want the ability for editors to be able to open up, like edit my component properties, and then just check a box that says use dark background or left align, center align. I can just have those, and those will directly tie to some like CSS classes that will get added in to the component. So those are really useful to add to your renderings. So yeah, that's a whirlwind tour of all those things within Sitecore SXA, Headless SXA rather. So you can see it's not just about the components. Like I've got there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 10 really useful things. So this is why I'd say even if your front end teams aren't happy with how the front end site is set up, all this Headless SXA stuff is really useful, and I think this is a big reason why Sitecore really push for you to use this, because you effectively would be throwing out useful ways to build things. And this is all supported. So if you have issues with how these work, like the redirect system, you are able to then speak to Sitecore support, say, oh, redirects are not working because of this reason, or page partials. They will be. This is all supported by Sitecore, so they'll be able to help you with this, rather than you having to build this all yourself and then make sure it's all working yourself. So yeah, they're all very useful. So I'll just finish up. That's been a sort of whirlwind tour of Headless SXA. Say whirlwind. It's 53 minutes I've been talking. It's quite well. So thank you for sticking with me. Yes. So I'll just touch on the last couple of things. So some useful resources. I have mentioned XM Cloud. This talk wasn't specifically about XM Cloud, but if you are interested in looking at using it, I would recommend you can Google XM Cloud recommended practices, or use this link. That said, I wrote this a few months ago, that page is now becoming out of date because Sitecore Accelerate, which is the new documentation that Sitecore created, is here. If you go to this page, that page is still up and it's got useful information, but there's also a link at the top that just warns you that it may be out of date, and it'll take you over to Sitecore Accelerate. So there's some useful things still on here, but Sitecore Accelerate is now sort of anything on there is the latest and greatest information. So I'd make use of both of them to learn. But Sitecore Accelerate is the sort of the definitive latest recommendations that are on there. Next up, there's also some Sitecore SXA best practices. So you can again use QR code or this link. That's something that Sitecore have published to go through. So that mentions certain things such as the flow component flow chart that I mentioned earlier, and other parts they have put into there. So it's another good resource if you're looking to use SXA. I'd look at the best practices document. So that covers other things that are going to be worth knowing. Thank you very much. That's my talk on Headless SXA. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. I haven't seen any come in the chat. If anyone has a question, I don't mind answering.
Oh, Thanks, Alex. For anybody, if you have any question, please put it on the chat window or raise your hand.
Maybe it's all stunned silence.
I guess the
It's
presentation was very clear. That's why it does not
I'll take
feel.
that as a I'll take it as a compliment rather than oh, if like this isn't interesting at all to me. I hope that's
Actually,
been
yeah, the
yeah. Go
reason
on.
maybe like from our organization, like we recently had a workshop XM Cloud. There we actually try to set up the XM Cloud and for the beginners as well. So maybe
Oh yeah,
they are still learning and they don't have any question maybe right now. But apart from
yes,
our
that's
organization, if you guys have any question, you can just raise your hand so we can have it here.
yeah. Yes, absolutely. And even if you don't want to ask anything today, like I said, I'm Kasaku on Slack. You can feel free to ask me a question on there as well. Yeah, like I said, the biggest takeaway from today is that if you're looking for headless in the future, this is what you should be. This is what you should be looking at. And yeah, that's the biggest thing I take away from today.
But yeah, this was a great presentation and it was really helpful for the beginner as well. Those haven't started with XM Cloud and even with Headless SXA yet. So, I mean, yeah, if you guys have any question related with these topics, or if you want to start on XM Cloud or Headless, so you can reach out to Alex on Slack and other social media network as well. Even you can reach out to the us as a Sitecore user group organization, and if there is something we can directly discuss with Alex, we can let your question with Alex, and he can answer there.
I've just put my name up there to remind anyone, especially if anyone came in late. That's me, Kasaku. Yes.
Is
Please
there
feel free to reach out.
is there a special meaning of this
Oh,
Kasak?
that's a good question. Thank you. Well, it's my so I'm a that's a good question. It's I'm a like I said, I'm a consultant, so it's my company name. And so it's a name I picked. It's Japanese for fine or hard work. So I quite liked that. I quite wanted something a bit abstract sounding. So
Yeah.
that's its meaning. But yeah, so for anyone, it's not got my name, so you don't necessarily know it's me. But that's the name I wanted. That I quite like it.
And can we get this PPT as well as a link? So if you can share.
Oh yes, absolutely yes. I will. I'll pass that on to you something afterwards.
Mhm.
I've got a link, like a presentation view of it as well. So yes, I will share that. I could do that. I'll do that immediately after, so you can share that around.
That's really great. Thanks.
We got some stuff from Doug.
Yeah, as I said, the problem is always, I think SXA should be known by everyone right now. We did also create SXA websites. It's a beautiful module, so I would never miss it again. But what we are struggling with is the transformation from MVC to Next.js. The customer just don't do it because it would be a rewrite of the whole page, and yeah, that's our problem. What we are figured with right now. Yeah.
I can certainly imagine. I'm not sure if fortunate is the right word, but I haven't been in the position yet of having to migrate, like to move to make that jump. The SXA and JSS sites I previously worked on have been ground up. They've been based on that, but I can certainly imagine the challenge. I'm in a similar position in terms of I'm working currently on an MVC site, and it would be a huge it is sort of kind of out of the question at the moment that it would migrate over, because it would be such an upheaval. It'd be really, but you'd be approaching it as a new project, I think.
Yeah, it's a new project, a rebuild,
Yeah,
rewrite everything.
exactly. I will say with XM Cloud, the other thing is also, if you're, again, I didn't really mention this actually, but it just reminded me that if you're on 10.3 today and you're not with XM Cloud yet, so if you're in the position of you are using 10.3 and you're in premise, if you build a site on Headless SXA, you are going to have a smoother transition to XM Cloud because it's XM Cloud, is Headless SXA as well. So that's why it's kind of recommended that even if you can't move to XM Cloud just yet, at least with Headless SXA, if you're building on that, you'll have a smoother transition over to XM Cloud. So that's a good idea. But yes, I empathize with you, Dirk. It's very difficult for those us on big sort of projects or to make that move. It's a new build. There's such a different way of approaching a site.
Yeah.
But good to hear about the SXA experience as well. It's really useful, all this stuff that you get out of the box. And I do know people who've done a lot more SXA than me who absolutely love it and just say it's just saves them so much time and they wouldn't use anything else now. Oh, okay. I can't see any other questions.
Yeah, I guess we are done as of now, but it's really great session, Alex, and thanks a lot for your time. And
No
we'll
problem. My pleasure.
Yeah, it's really great session, and maybe people grasp everything, and that's why we have short of question this time. Otherwise, we used to have multiple questions. So it's really heads off to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks all for joining in. Thank
you
you.
so much,
Bye
everyone.
bye.
Thanks, Alex. Bye.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.